This right here is the January 6th insurrection, the protests, the riots that were going on January 6th. They play footage from that in the background as the national anthem goes on and he pledges allegiance to the riots. Like, I assume it's to the United States, but kind of a mixed message here. We will not, due to the kindness of my heart, watch the entirety of the Trump Waco rally. But I do want to talk about the Trump Waco rally, because the Trump Waco rally was pretty crazy. There were a lot of crazy moments. There are a lot of moments that feel like is just straight up baiting civil war. And this is also correlating with statements by Trump publicly of destruction in the streets if he gets arrested. It seems like the Trump campaign is in like full overdrive right now when it comes to not only extremism, but when it comes to like just the most clear bait of like, the people must save me, get onto the streets, do what is necessary. It is getting pretty weird. He's talking a little bit more like an Eastern European oligarch than he is a American candidate for president. So before we get into those statements, I want to start with the real intelligence of the event, because I don't want to be accused of avoiding the smart things that Trump speakers have to say, the important political commentary. So I want to bring forward, before we get into these more kind of like Civil War baity statements, the intelligent philosopher of the right wing, Ted Nugent, who was in the rally, which is located, by the way, in Waco, Texas, 20 years after the after the big, we'll just call it the big fire. Pretty wild it's in Waco. And this is what this great philosopher Ted Nugent has to say about the war in Ukraine. This is all he has to say about it. Let's hear what he has to say.
I want my money back. I didn't authorize any money to Ukraine to some homosexual weirdo. I want my money back.
So there's some levels to this. There's some levels to this. First off, congratulations to Zelensky for coming out of the closet. Very happy for you. You know, I mean, there's a lot going on in his life right now, and this is going to make it a little bit more hectic to know that Zelensky is a femboy enjoyer. That's the first thing. Second thing, he says that I didn't authorize any money to Ukraine. I want my money back. How does he think money is authorized? Does he think that like he needs to be there and be like, excuse me, Mr. Government, I heard you did a speed bump in California the other day. I heard you funded a speed bump, but you didn't check with Mr. Country Music Lesson Mr. Country Music Legend Ted Nugent. Oh, I heard you were gonna fund the police department. Well, excuse me, buckaroo, but those federal funds aren't allowed to go to the police department until Ted Nugent gets his say. You want to know how you got your say? You participated in the 2022 primary election. You want to know how you got your say? You participated in the 2020 presidential election. We're a representative democracy. We have been that since our foundation. We do not sit down and vote on every little itty bitty issue, every little piece of dollars, because that wouldn't work with a nation of our size, and we cannot expect that every single citizen is going to know everything necessary about every single piece of legislation. We have legislatures, and we vote for them in order for them to have that expertise, have that experience, know how to legislate, know how to budget, know how to go through committee hearings, know how the whole process. They introduce the legislation, they're with the legislation, they don't just have you randomly look at it at the end of the day. That's not to say we can't have referendums, but I find it hard to believe that if we were to have a referendum right now on aid to Ukraine, the majority of Americans would say, no aid to Ukraine. All the polling data I've seen, even if we have seen a marked decrease in the overall support to sending military aid to Ukraine, the majority of Americans still support aid to Ukraine. And even if it goes down, it's much more likely it's going to hit a plurality of Americans still support aid to Ukraine before a majority of Americans oppose aid to Ukraine, or a plurality of Americans oppose aid to Ukraine. So that's the second thing. The last thing is, I don't know where this came from. I know recently there was a Russia Today segment about Zelensky being gay. Actually, I think we can pull it up. There was a segment on Russia Today about Zelensky being gay, and specifically Zelensky being gay with Boris Johnson. So it was like a sexual romance thriller for Zelensky. He's been going through, he's been going through the levels. He's been going through, yeah, here it is right here. Propagandists admit that blah blah blah. I never know how to pronounce his name. Arestovich, somebody who works close to Zelensky, is gay, and Zelensky is also most likely gay. Let's listen to what he has to say.
Нонсенс, что у нас там человек
You can't understand the most important thing. Oh, 1 second. Damn, this is fast. You can't understand the most important thing. Ukraine welcomes you as an agent, you see. In our country, it's nonsense that a person from intelligence agency is a traitor. But it is welcome there. You all have to understand this. On the contrary, the person boasts about it. I'm an MI6 agent. I work with SAS. I work at the 73rd Naval Special Purpose Center in Okrovich. Who trains you? SBS trains me. It's cool with them, you see. That's the thing. I have a quick question. Is the fact that there is a compromising gay material in Arestovich and that he's an MI6 agent somehow related? As for the compromising gay material and all the rest of them, LGBT, he tries to say LGBT here, but he says LSB. I don't think he knows the letters. It's all welcome there. It's not compromising material. You have to understand that for them, this LGBT is not compromising material. It's one of the options that fit. That's why I'm asking. You quoted from the Telegram channel report on Zelensky, The Road to War. A very interesting report. I recommend everyone read it. And it says, as a joke, that these constant meetings between Zelensky and Uncle Boris Johnson, who is basically nobody but still comes to Kiev, are explained by some very specific nature of their relationship. And my point is that maybe, given that deep Ukraine is such a traditional religious country, there could be compromising gay material on Zelensky as well. Okay, so not only is this accusing other people around Zelensky of being gay and having compromising gay material on him, but Zelensky himself is gay, and he's gay with Boris Johnson. And there, of course, is the shock and awe at the idea that in the West, the quote-unquote West that they're referring to, I'm not a huge fan of the term, but in the United States, in Germany, in Italy, and all these other countries, being gay isn't compromising. And they take like a, oh my God, really? You can suck cock in the West and that's okay? Yes. Yes, you can. This is something that only works with the Russian domestic media sphere. This only works in their information sphere. But every once in a while, statements like that or Russian state media statements, it'll start to seep out. And a few Americans who have access to all the information in the world, they could Google this information themselves. They could go listen to critical journalists reviewing this Russian propaganda. They could go out and they could look at all the information made available to them, which all points against any conclusion like this, just like they could have done with Bucha, just like they could have done with Izium, just like they could have done with the weapons of mass destruction that the Russians claim were in Ukraine, just like they could have done with the idea that the Ukrainians invaded Russia, or any number of baseless conspiracy theories or nonsense. They will accept it in order to be anti-establishment nature. They will accept it because it was never about truly being anti-establishment and fighting the power. It was simply about virtue signaling against the American establishment, which you don't trust. You just dropped one establishment for another establishment. But for whatever reason, Ted Nugent has doubled down on the statement, saying, I didn't call him a homosexual weirdo. He is a homosexual weirdo. 4.2 million views, 40,000 likes. I love this country and I love everyone in it. I love this country and I love everyone in it. Moving on from the homosexual weirdo claim, let's continue. This is from the Donald Trump rally. This is also on the topic of Ukraine before we get to the Civil War bait, where he says that Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine wants to get all of Ukraine, wants to take all of Ukraine. And he says now it looks like Putin is going to get the whole thing, that Putin's going to get all of Ukraine, that all of Ukraine is going to Putin. And this is all because of those dastardly Democrats, that under him, there would have been no war and he would have been able to negotiate a deal. Now, he doesn't often mention, and his supporters don't often mention, that he recently, while on a conservative program, even said that he'd be willing to give up Ukrainian territory to find a deal. So when we say, oh, Trump's an amazing negotiator, that's why he could find the deal. No, it's that Trump on day one would probably be willing to secede to most of Russia's demands while trying to pretend that he's strong and he's powerful and he's a good negotiator. What he's really going to go in there is he's going to walk in there. Putin's going to say 120% of what he wants. Trump's going to negotiate him down to 100% of what he wants, and then Putin gets 100% of what he wants. That's exactly how it would go. But let's listen to Trump.
I get along well with Putin. I used to talk to Putin about it. It's something he certainly had in his mind. Never even talked about it. For 4 years, you didn't even hear about it. As soon as I was out or left, or however you want to describe that catastrophe, they started putting soldiers on the border. But even then, he didn't want to do it. He wanted to get a peace. Now it looks like he'll end up probably getting the whole thing.
He says even then he didn't want to do it. He wanted to get a peace. Okay, so first on the idea that Trump leaves office, then Putin invades. I think he is under the assumption that the West could have done something in those days to stop this invasion when it comes to conceding something to Putin. And my question would be, what would we concede? There were demands that we end our protection of Eastern European states, like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, with American nuclear weapons, basically removing the nuclear protections that they enjoy as members of NATO. That would be a non-starter to anyone, any NATO country you ask them. That's a non-starter. We could have cut up Ukraine and say, okay, fine, you can have Zaporozhye, you can have Kherson, you can have the rest of Donetsk. We will displace millions upon millions of people. You can engage in your cleansing operations, rounding up people, executing them, and dumping them in mass graves, which is what they did when they took Kiev. Some people try to say oh, the violence was all just individual soldiers. A lot of it was state sponsored by the Russian state. There were these cleansing operations, and I call them cleansing operations not because that sounds ominous, but that's the word the Russians used, where they would go to door looking for people associated with the government and the military, take them out, interrogate them, shoot them, then put them in a mass grave. This is because they wanted to occupy the country, and they thought if they killed everybody who possibly could resist in advance, then it would be difficult for the Ukrainians to resist, because they knew that what they were doing would not be accepted by everyone, to say the least. And so Trump seems perfectly willing to give that up from what he said in other interviews. And from here, he seems to be under the delusion that if we just would have had a different president, that all of the interests that align to make Putin invade, all of the miscalculations he made to think that the Ukrainians wouldn't resist, all of that would be solved by the master negotiator, Donald Trump. You remember when Donald Trump went to North Korea to negotiate? After doing the fire and fury statements, all of Trump's supporters seem to be very concerned about the idea of nuclear war with Russia right now. But when Trump was saying fire and fury towards North Korea, nobody cared. It was super strong and super cool. But now, if we don't engage in nuclear escalatory rhetoric, but just send weapons to Ukraine being invaded, that's too much. But saying fire and fury in reaction to a nuclear threat, that isn't too much. He goes and negotiates with the North Koreans. He stops military drills with South Korea, a concession. He gives them a concession to get into negotiations, gets into negotiations, basically pitches the North Koreans a McDonald's in every street corner in exchange for the nuclear weapons, all of them in one go. They obviously reject it. They obviously were not going to accept it. Negotiations collapsed, and by the end of his term, the North Koreans were blowing up the South Korean liaison office on national television. So why should I believe that this person who got the Baltic states and the Balkans mixed up while visiting the Baltic states, asking the Baltic states, how was your civil war? Asking their leaders that, them just looking at him confused. How is that person with that little amount of knowledge on this region of the world and with such interesting negotiating tactics going to stop the Russians from invading? How? How is he going to do it? What's going to fundamentally change? I remember some people will say, and this is the biggest argument I hear, Trump is a good, strong leader in the way that he's unpredictable. And so the Russians would see his unpredictability and they would just start shaking in his boots, right? That even though the Russians wanted him to win the presidential election, apparently they're also scared of him. They want him to win, but they're also terrified. I don't buy it. The Russian campaign was not based upon, in 1 year from now, when we're fighting to take Bakhmut, after 8 and 9 months of fighting to take a city of 70,000 people, will the Russians send F-16s? That wasn't what the Russians were wargaming in planning for this war. They thought the war would last like a week. I think Lukashenko said 1 to 3 days on public television. The U.S. intelligence seems to indicate 1 to 3 days seems to be the general idea of how long they thought this would take as well. Maybe a week to 2 weeks maximum. And so if the Russians believed that they could just do what they did in Crimea, just walk in, threaten the people involved, threaten government officials, hold them at gunpoint, and then take over the whole country, why would they need to even consider American response outside of American immediate response? And Trump's immediate response would not be, we're going to blow up your jets, we're going to put American troops on the ground, as he's trying to, make the argument we need to pull out of Afghanistan. I doubt he's going to do that. I know that Trump doesn't really have a consistent foreign policy belief. He doesn't believe anything consistently about foreign policy outside of let's loot and let's pillage and let's act like the fucking mafia on the international stage. That was his argument for staying in northeastern Syria, not stopping a Turkish invasion, anti-ISIS operations, or, sticking with our allies. For him, it was just the oil, the oil, the oil. I really don't think that the Russians would change that calculation, that they would no longer believe that it would be a short war. I believe they would still overestimate themselves, underestimate the Ukrainians, and still go in. And I don't think Trump being in office would fundamentally change that.
But I've never seen anything like it, what's happened. And if you saw the other day with President Xi, smart, top of his game. President Putin, smart, very smart people, standing there talking about the world order for the next 100 years. I got along well with Putin. I used to talk to Putin about it. Moving on from this, let's move on to the more Civil War-y bait that was kind of strange. So this rally in Waco opened with a January 6th choir. There's an image that I want to show you that correlates with this. It's kind of hard to explain what's happening here without this image. So in the image behind Trump, you can see this being played. This right here is the January 6th insurrection, the protests, the riots that were going on January 6th. They play footage from that in the background as the national anthem goes on and he pledges allegiance to the riots. Like I assume it's to the United States, but kind of a mixed message here. And you would think somebody like Donald Trump would try to distance himself from the January 6th riots. But as I talked about when reviewing the Tucker Carlson segment on January 6th, I believe that the Republican media establishment, anything under the brand of Rupert Murdoch, anything associated with, for example, Newsmax, OAN, the Trump brand itself, I believe that they are now trying to whitewash what happened on January 6th. When January 6th happened, it plummeted Trump's approval rating into like the low 30s. It was not good for him. It was terrible. It was the lowest his approval rating had been for the entirety of his presidency. He was reaching Bush at the end of his presidency, 2008 financial crisis numbers. Not looking good for Trump. And this is something that has stuck with him for a time, and he has recovered somewhat in the polls, but he's never fully recovered. And so I believe that people like Tucker Carlson and other people in the Republican media sphere sees how, even though he hasn't been able to shake off January 6th, even though he hasn't been able to shake off all of his other scandals, whether it was him calling for the permanent suspension of the U.S. Constitution, whether it was any of his other comments, his call to ban Muslims from the United States. People challenge me on that claim, but I stand by it. And if anybody wants to challenge me, they can email me at DylanBurnsTV@gmail.com. I stand by that claim that he wanted to ban Muslims from coming into the United States, which is unconstitutional, but he wants to suspend the U.S. Constitution permanently. So
Why would he care in the first place? I think they want to whitewash what happened so Trump can use it as a political martyr event while these January 6th protests were martyred and they're all in prison and Ashley Babbitt was murdered and it's all just so terrible. Completely ignore all the cops that got injured while being a back the blue candidate. Completely ignore the endangerment to the lives of the legislature. Completely ignore that the whole event was about uprooting American democracy and trying to force Mike Pence to not certify the election. Completely ignore the fact that they actually did attempt to stop the certification of the election, and they did block the process for hours, something that's unprecedented in American history. Ignore all of that and just pay attention to the sad man with the MAGA hat behind bars. Very sad, very prosecutorial, very, very oppressive, very terrible. And you tune in to Tucker Carlson's show. That's the type of whitewashing he's doing. Here is the clip of this fantastic January 6th choir.
Ladies and gentlemen, please rise and place your hand over your heart for the #1 song on iTunes, Amazon, and the Billboard charts, Justice for All, featuring President Donald J. Trump and the J6 Choir.
Pretty wild. The January 6th choir. He's taking one of his most, I would say, most terrible political moments where Donald Trump genuinely wanted to see the Democratic results of the election overturned. Just like same reason he called Brian Raffensperger of Georgia and tried to force him to just find the votes for him to be the winner. He continues this undemocratic pattern he seems to have. But not only does he martyr these people on January 6th, he has the Texas Agricultural Commissioner, Sid Miller, come out and speak at his event about how they're fighting the traitors. And the way he draws the line in the sand is very much how somebody would draw the line in the sand before going to war. Patriots versus traitors.
You know, we got a big fight ahead of us, but we're used to that. Especially us Texans are real resilient. We're up to the task. You know, when I started in politics a few years back, it was the Republicans versus the Democrats. And then it changed into something totally different. It became conservatives against liberals. Now we've gone beyond that. And I'm convinced today it's patriots versus the traitors. And I'm a patriot. What about you?
Okay. The thing that always gets me about this, because I got a very similar reaction on January 6th. I wore like a Biden hoodie to January 6th. Not the smartest thing I've ever done, gotta be honest. Was threatened on a few occasions. Did see some violence. Didn't get attacked directly, but I did see violence, and very lucky I didn't get attacked directly. But some of the reactions I got there was very much like, you're a traitor. And I said, okay, in what way? You voted for Biden. As if voting in a different way from you is treason. And to be clear, in the United States, treason is punishable by death. We still have the death penalty in the United States. You can go out and put somebody behind bars for treason and kill them in this country. So when you accuse somebody of a crime that is worthy of the death penalty according to the US legal system, I think maybe you should, you know, have a little bit more merit behind the claim, maybe a little bit more evidence, something to back it up, because this isn't just getting sent out to the US judicial system. Obviously, the judicial system isn't going to arrest every Democrat for being a Democrat because they're traitors. That's silly. But if you're somebody at this event where you're having the January 6th rioters who stormed the Capitol lauded as martyrs, where you're having Donald Trump, which we're going to get into his statement he said online in a second, Donald Trump talking about the need for people to come out and fight for him if he gets arrested. You've got this guy drawing the line in the sand between traitors and conservative patriots, right? This sounds like Civil War bait. When you start calling your political opposition traitors, that is when democracy starts to break down. That's when one side starts to do everything possible to fuck over the other side, even at the expense of democracy. Like Donald Trump tried to do in the last election when executive orders were being written up to seize voting machines with the military. When you start to be unable to, when you're unable to live with the people you disagree with politically as a country, and you just designate them all as traitors and horrible and impossible to negotiate with, impossible to live with, then the country begins to break down, begins to fall apart, and the country stops functioning. And that's when you actually start getting on the civil war path. It is statements like this and figures like this that get our country closer to neighbor killing neighbor, to people throwing pipe bombs through the windows of homes, killing families of 5. It is language like this that gets us closer to this. But he's not the president of the United States. He's not very well known. That's not a huge concern. You know, it's not the worst thing in the world. Well, let's look at the type of rhetoric Trump gave at this rally. You know, not the worst, still not good. And then let's look what he said on Truth Social. Listen to this. Listen to this stuff.
Justice will only be done when we have...
All right, I have it at 1.5.
Justice will only be done when we have thrown this repulsive political class the hell out of office. We have to get them out. In 2016, I declared, I am your voice. And now I say to you again tonight, I am your warrior. I am your justice. And I took a lot of heat for this one, but I only mean it in the proper way for those who have been wronged and betrayed, of which there are many people out there that have been wronged and betrayed. I am your retribution. We will take care of it. We will.
What does that even mean? I mean this in the right way. I am your retribution. What the fuck does that mean? What's the right way? That sounds like something somebody would say before, like, I don't mean, okay, maybe I'm going a little hard here, but that sounds like something like an IRA sniper would say before going out and doing something, you know, revenge, you know, that's what it sounds like. This, it's like, he says that it's the most like plausible, deniable way he could say it, but the idea of being the retribution, what does that even mean? And that's the thing that scares me, is we see that people have sent powder to the DA, Alvin Bragg, who is trying to, who might be sentencing Trump in New York. We see the pipe bombs that were sent to AOC, Nancy Pelosi, and all these people. We see these people with hammers go into the home of AOC and beat their husband half to death because they wanted to capture Nancy and break her kneecaps to show as a representative, to show as an example against the deep state. We see all these instances of political violence. We saw January 6th. We saw some of the activity during the riots following the murder of George Floyd. Obviously, I can argue about different conditions and different reasons, but there was political violence that occurred after that as well. And the thing that I really don't like is the plausible, deniable, like pitter-patter, tiptoeing statements like this. Because this is the stuff that if you're a normal person, you hear, you can maybe try to interpret it as, well, he means that we need to find accountability for the people who, you know, wronged the American system and, you know, make sure we hold criminals to account. But if you're a schizophrenic, if you're an insane person, and I'm sorry to say there seems to be a decent amount of them in the Trump movement, you hear this could come in, this could mean a million different things. This could mean violent retribution. This could mean retribution for the January 6th martyrs, the martyrs of J6, who almost saved our democracy by grabbing that Nancy Pelosi by her hair and dragging her out of Congress. It is the like borderline jihad statements that always scare me the most about Trump. Like, of course, if he came out and said, we must bomb the infidel. Of course, if he came out and said something like that, it'd be worse. But he knows, as somebody who works with PR, works with media, he can't come out and say something like that. So he's pitter-pattering his statements all around. And the thing that really, really got me, because this isn't the worst part, the retribution isn't the worst part, it's just kind of confusing and a little concerning. It was this statement on Truth Social recently that really, really rustled my jimmies as a libtard. Trump warns of potential death and destruction if he's charged in hush money probe. This sounds like an MS-13 leader, cartel leader. This doesn't sound like a U.S. presidential candidate. The former president escalated his attacks on the Manhattan District Attorney's investigation with an explicit reference to violence in an overnight post on Truth Social. Former President Donald Trump escalated his rhetoric against the Manhattan District Attorney's probe into his hush money payment made during his 2016 campaign, warning in an overnight post of his Truth Social site about potential death and destruction if he is charged in the case. Last week, Trump said leaks indicated he would be arrested in the investigation and called on his supporters to protest, take the nation back. Since then, he has used social media to attack Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, calling for his removal from the post and claiming without evidence that the probe is politically motivated. This is something that I went back and forth with Michael Tracy on. It's up on my second channel, DylanBurnsLIVE, if you wanted to go check it out. I think I made a decent case as to why we don't know that it's politically motivated. I do want to just say here quickly, Alvin Bragg is somebody, like, none of us knew who this guy was before this indictment. Now he's like on the number, he's like the #1 hit list candidate for like the far right now. The amount of death threats he has gotten, the people sending like white powder substances to try to intimidate him, like through terror stuff, it's absolutely crazy. But when it comes to this like protest stuff, take the nation back, Trump said that he would get arrested last Tuesday. It didn't happen. Trump wasn't arrested. There was no perp walk. He was not taken away in cuffs. It didn't happen. Of course, he was the only source that it was going to happen Tuesday. But now we're just kind of like waiting in suspense, hoping or that we'll get some update in the near future. I assume, this is my assumption, I don't have evidence to back this up, but this I'm trying to like calculate as to why he said Tuesday. I think that he heard from his attorneys that the earliest he could get arrested is Tuesday. Therefore, he told everybody he was getting arrested Tuesday, either to get them on the case quicker or because he didn't take in all the information and then said it would happen Tuesday. Last weekend, Trump said leaks indicated he would be arrested in an investigation and called on his supporters to protest, take our nation back. Since then, he has used social media to attack Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, calling for his removal from the post and claiming without evidence that the probe is politically motivated. But the early Friday post on Truth Social marks Trump's most explicit reference to violence yet, echoing his intensified rhetoric during the events that led up to January 6th, assault on the U.S. Capitol. What kind of person can charge another person, in this case, a former president of the United States, who got more votes than any sitting president in history and leading candidates by far for the Republican nomination, with a crime when it is known by all that no crime has been committed, and also known that potential death and destruction in such a false charge could be catastrophic for this country? Why and who would do such a thing? Only a degenerate psychopath that truly hates the USA. Okay, so let's get the easy stuff out of the way first. First off, he has not gotten the most votes ever, because he says here, former president of the United States who got more votes than any sitting president in history. So this is a very unique way to word what he's saying, because if he can't say that he got the most votes of any presidential candidate in history, because that would be Joe Biden. But he did get the most votes of any sitting president in history, so he brags about it. But that's not that impressive when in the election he's bragging about getting the most votes in is an election that he lost the popular vote in. It's just, kind of silly to be charging up and down the street, bragging about that. He says it's known by all that no crime has been committed. Well, apparently not to Alvin Bragg. If you would ask me, I would talk about that call to Brian Raffensperger, which I believe is criminal. We can talk about all the other ongoing lawsuits when it comes to Trump We could talk about Trump University and the fact that Trump has committed crimes in the past. So it's not like, oh my God, it's incredible and crazy to think that Trump could ever commit a crime. It's quite silly. Obviously, we cannot charge him for the crimes of the past, but the idea that everyone knows that he committed no crime, just silly. Now, here's the main thing that we need to talk about. Also known that potential death and destruction in such a false charge could be catastrophic for our country. So this is Donald Trump saying that if he gets arrested, there's going to be death and destruction in the country. Now, the obvious assumption here is he is saying that if he gets arrested, his supporters will be so enraged, will be so outraged, will be so angry that they're going to go out and they're going to riot and they're going to kill people. Maybe they're going to plant bombs in metro stations. Maybe they're going to plant bombs in high risers. Maybe they're going to go shoot somebody. Maybe they're going to go try to lynch Alvin Bragg. Maybe they're going to go try to find anybody that, you know, Trump doesn't like. Maybe they'll try to beat Nancy Pelosi to death with a hammer again. Who knows? But there's going to be death and destruction in reaction to this. Now, this to me is very clear cut. This to me, anybody with 2 brain cells, now I know that's asking a lot of Donald Trump here, should be able to see the implications that people will assume off of reading this post. And if he's going to be president of the United States, he should, you know, be careful about the words he says and whether it can be interpreted to be violent in nature. And I know some people are saying, oh, that's difficult because when somebody says fighting, you know, what they could mean is politically fighting. We've had so many presidents speak in a manner that did not inspire political violence on the streets. It is not that difficult to not accidentally say or purposely say, this was purposely said, he wrote it out, if I get arrested, there'll be death and destruction in the streets. That sounds like a call to violence. That sounds like a direct reference to kind of, you know, remember that stand back and stand by thing he said to the Proud Boys. This says like, look, if I get arrested, who knows what my supporters will do? And even if it isn't him directly calling for the supporters to come out and be violent, it does sound like he's saying, look, if I get arrested, you know, when you consider arresting me, do consider the fact that my people might have pipe bombs, my people might have Molotovs, my people might have guns. In fact, I'm positive they have guns. So take that into consideration when you're arresting me. So this is, there's only the most charitable interpretation in my mind is he's saying, back off with the investigation. Who knows what my supporters might do when I get angry? The most aggressive interpretation of this is a direct call to violence, saying supporters engage in the jihad if I get arrested. Now, this is the interpretation I've gotten from Trump supporters after I posted this on Twitter, saying that this sounded like a cartel boss. This didn't sound like the former president of the United States. What I've heard is that Donald Trump is genuinely concerned about the possible violence that could occur in the fallout of his arrest, and so he is warning the people in advance of the violence that could occur in his arrest so they can be safe and that there can be good police response. That is such a reach that you got to be
Burns is a
made of
immoral,
rubber
morally corrupt,
to believe that
bankrupt
nonsense.
man.
I don't buy it. I don't buy it for a moment. That seems like him leveraging some of the violence his supporters have engaged in the past and the possibility of violence in the future to try to get out of charges or a direct call to violence. I believe if you accept that last interpretation, that you're kind of coping. You're not seething, but you are coping. You are coping. Blue Rider of Neptune, thank you so much for the tier 2. The tier 2 in gutter chat being sub for 10 months. He's dropping money on tier 2s and he isn't doing it in site chat. While it's financially irresponsible, this is our equivalent of buying gold rims in gutter chat. So I just want to wrap up with this. Putting aside all the Civil War bait, putting aside my interpretation of these statements, Donald Trump is not responsible enough for us to ever give him the executive branch again. He's not careful with his actions. He's not careful with his words. He says things off the cuff, and he doesn't just say mild things off the cuff like, oh, woot nanny or something like some just cute little ism, right? He like fumbles on his words a bit or something, or he, you know, throws out something wacky. His wacky statements are calls to violence, fire and fury, and high stakes negotiation outbursts. Not things that are very safe for our country. Not things that are very helpful for our country. Donald Trump should be kept away from the levers of power. I believe that if we allow Trump back into office, he is going to do his best to learn from the mistakes of January 6th. And he's going to learn, and we can see him trying to, when I say learn the mistakes of January 6th, what I mean is, he's going to learn the mistakes of January 6th so he can try to do it better again next time, as in try to get people to stop the certification of the vote better next time. Then he learned from the lessons of January 6th and he's no longer going to be violent, or he's no longer going to call for violence, or vaguely call for violence, or slightly indicate violence in some way. I think this kind of shows he hasn't learned that lesson from January 6th, and the lesson he took away is how to better do it next time, which to me is pretty scary. Oh my gosh, man. What a psycho. Got to keep him away from the levers of power. My God, man. I am not looking forward to a Donald Trump presidency if he wins again. Also, we'll wrap up this segment with this clip, because this clip is great. It deserves no commentary.
And I made farmers happy and rich again, and they're doing a fantastic job. And you know what? Someday it'll become time for them to leave this beautiful earth, and they'll be able to leave their farm without taxes to their children. I got rid of the death tax on farms so that when you do pass away, on the assumption that you love your children, you can leave it to them and they won't have to pay tax. But if you don't love your children so much, and there are some people that don't, and maybe deservedly so, it won't matter, because frankly, you don't have to leave them anything. Thank you very much. Have
all of his children off camera sweating, taking out dabbing their forehead. He looks over to Jared. Jared's his only one he likes. Only likes Jared Kushner. Only likes Jared. Hates everyone else and his hot daughters.